everybody, and welcome to Martial Africa. As always, I'm Fushia. Today I'm chatting with a good friend of mine, Kenny Oxley.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Right, so just like with any podcast, you try to get everybody involved. It's all been my students up to now, which is fantastic. I do feel running a dojo does give you the opportunity to meet a bunch of people. And I think ever since you started with us, it was from day one, it's very clear that your interests are very much where my interests lie. A lot of it is a deep love for the martial arts, then a deep love for history, and then specifically South Africa. So Kenny, do tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? How do you link with history? And a bit about your martial arts.
Well, let's start with the martial arts stuff, because I started, training martial arts with you at, what was that, 2019? Well, no, not quite. It was actually during COVID. COVID had already started.
Yes.
It started online. Martial arts is something I was been interested in. As a kid, I did a bit of kung fu, but it wasn't that serious. I had a little background doing like jiu-jitsu and things like that, so that was always fun. But I think going and beginning to train with y'all was sort of my first serious foray to do it more consistently, very seriously. So that has been fun. That's how I connect this side. What do I do? My very best. My very best.
I hear you.
I work in tourism. Specifically, well, I have what's the word I'm looking for? Specific interests and stuff in cultural history, specifically cultural history in South Africa. And without being able to do anything academically, it sort of makes better sense to sort of do tourism with that, because financially speaking, I'd be paid a whole lot better to be telling tourists about the cultural history of South Africa than than writing academic papers about the cultural history of South Africa. So, the archaeology and the history and stuff is interesting and stuff, but it doesn't always pay the bills as much as you'd like. So, from a history standpoint, tourism is how I sort of get that out there and get to express and experience and have other people experience the history and archaeology and things in South Africa that they wouldn't always be generally aware of otherwise.
I think I went on at least, how many tours did I go on with you? 2, 3?
3.
3.
Yeah, and 3 already.
And I'm a person who low-key prides myself on that. I know a thing or two about my own country. I really don't. I really don't. And it's really one trip to Pretoria, a trip to Johannesburg, and then a couple of other things in between. I'm just like, oh, there's a lot of history that I don't know. There's a lot of nuance in our country that I just don't know. I think one of the nuances that I do want to chat about, I've been just casually looking into a lot of the warfare in South Africa and what it looked like. And the politics behind the warfare is almost a separate topic to how it was fought. And that's something that's not often approached a lot, is the man on the ground. I remember going to Isandlwana and the tour guide there told us how far the regiments had to run, and just thinking to myself, like, I can't run that on the sidewalk. Give me a nice pair of running shoes, say you have to run this far in this amount of time, and now there's no roads,
and then fight a battle,
for
your life at the end of that,
and that immediately starts making you wonder about the training that they went through, what did the martial art look like. I think the closest thing that we can easily see is stick fighting. Stick fighting is very popular. I've spoken to people not just from the Zulu culture, but where stick fighting plays a role. But how do you fight with a traditional ikla? How do you use the big shield? Those details. I'm sure they're not lost. But what do you know about this aspect?
Well, I mean, if you're mentioning Isandlwana, then we can start a little bit there. So you have a standpoint where in this scenario, the British military were well trained, most certainly, very well trained, but they moved generally at a slower pace, right? They had more wagons, more supplies, all of these kinds of things. And one can make the argument that they may have not been as fit, right? Whereas the Zulu army, the average everyday man would be working as a laborer. He didn't, sit down and do nothing all day, These are people who worked every day of their lives, and then on top of that would be training, in the military. So, you're doing a day's physical labor, right? And then you're also doing military training at the same time. So in terms of fitness, that is a notable advantage that an army like the Zulu army would have is fitness. It's why armies, one particular scenario is the regiments that were under the control of Prince Dabula Manzi that basically marched from the one end of Zululand all the way to the other end of Zululand in a single day and still fought a battle on the other side, to win, too. So to have that kind of fitness is no easy feat.
Yeah.
So part of what goes into what makes your army is, fitness. Your everyday guy has got to be fit. He's got to be doing his burpees and push-ups and, whatever it is. People like Shaka Zulu, who created such a big reform to military ideas in the Zulu Empire, felt running was like the superior way to get fit.
Yeah.
And quite a few decades down the line, when we get to moments like Isanbana, then you see, hey, that culture of like running is the superior fitness method. It shows there immediately in that the army is fresher and they can do more with less.
Yeah.
In terms of what you were saying with the stick fighting is a thing that all humans do it. I cannot think of society that has not engaged in that.
Yeah, true.
The moment man discovered stick, we discovered we can also hit each other with it. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
So it's like one of the first default things that you work with.
Yeah.
And in the context of many indigenous societies in South Africa, that was the first way, young boys start training. You're not going to give a small boy a whole spear that's way taller than him, he can barely hold, It's like, no, you start him with something like an iwisa, a good old knopkeri, something that he can work with, at least. So, you build up your skills to these kinds of things.
Question, you mentioned the differences between you kind of separated the warrior, which is a society, and then a martial society.
Yes.
What are the actual differences between the two?
So let's boil it down to like the individuals. What's a soldier and what's a warrior? A soldier is in the most contemporary way of using that phrase. It's a person who works in the government's military, and you would. I think the average is like 6 months of training before you get, your first official post as, I can't remember, I don't even know how the military works. But to be honest, there's this whole, it is what we see as a military, and a soldier, you can get soldiers who are very, very good. They're incredibly good at fighting in strategically, in formations and whatnot. But a warrior society, although their battle tactics, like in the Zulu case, they also had lines, people fighting in lines, fighting in formation, but their whole culture for young men is orientated to train constantly. It's a warrior. It's a lifestyle for a warrior. For a soldier, you get a full-time soldier, you get a career soldier, and that's slightly different. I think they're on the boundary between the two, but usually a soldier is there for a couple of years, and then his term comes to an end.
I understand. I'm sorry to derail a bit. Do you think you can give a few, just off the top of your head, examples of warrior culture in history?
So, yes, absolutely. I think if we put it on a spectrum, and we take it all the way to the other side of the globe, some of your Native American cultures, like your Comanche and your Lakota nations, and so on, these were warrior societies, smaller societies. So the way they made war was different. It's what a conventional military sense you would call a lot of skirmishes, but that's how they made war. Your hit and run tactics, and their whole life they would be riding horses, shooting bows and arrows. Very good. As soon as they started getting in contact with firearms, they acquired firearms and learned how to shoot with it from horseback. That's a warrior society. I would put the Zulu kingdom in a warrior society that was most probably, in retrospect, going to go over to something different, more of a medieval kingdom with maybe a standing army. But still, they had that very strong cultural thing. And I think that's most probably one of the reasons why I did start this channel, is because South Africa is rich in that. We always talk about the Zulu people, and there's a lot there, and that's where I started. But the more I'm looking into the topic, the more and more cultures you see also had this. Yeah.
So with the Vikings, the samurai, those societies as well, that would count as warrior cultures and not necessarily military or martial.
I guess it's very in the weeds. I don't know.
Yeah, that's one thing with the
With things like Vikings, Viking was a profession. It's a raider. It's a pillager.
It's a pirate.
Exactly. So to some extent, that particular profession, if you think of it as a profession, then I suppose I would delegate it to like career war rather than culture. Like war is not a culture; it's a career, and I think that's where you make the difference there. Where in scenarios like some Native American tribes, amongst the Zulu and everything, war is an intricate part of the culture, right? Rather than just a career. You're not just a warrior just because it pays well.
Okay.
You're a warrior because it is functionally ingrained and intertwined with your identity and the identity of your people and your nation. And I don't think that was necessarily. I'm not an expert on Vikings but I don't think that was necessarily the same thing. I think we're raiders and pillagers because man, it makes good bucks.
Okay. I'd say you already told me more because I thought it was a group of people. I thought it was a society, and now I just it wasn't.
Yeah, that is actually it's a very common misconception.
The Vikings were all Scandinavians, but the Viking is a pirate. One day, I'm wondering one day if we're going to look back on Somali piracy and be like, I'm going to have a birthday party themed after this, and it's just a Somali pirate. That's what we're doing. That's what we're doing. Even your eye patch, I'm Blackbeard, kind of interaction. That's if you really think about it. And I'm not here to be that boomer who spoils everybody's fun, but it's glorifying a bunch of raping,
pillaging pirates,
pirates on the sea. That's actually what it is. But in the case of Japanese culture, they did a funky thing, an interesting thing, where they took their society and they put it in classes. And the Bushi class, the samurai class, they had a warrior culture within a culture that weren't...
Because not everybody could only be a samurai if you're born into a samurai family.
Yes, you have to be part of the family, yes. You have to be in the caste. It's like the caste system, in a way. And that's a way, I think, when everything becomes formalized and there's standing armies and so on, but you still have this caveat within your culture for warfare. Instead of everybody being a warrior, you dedicate it to a single caste. A lot of cultures does this. There is a historical site, Kenny, that you were working on. Now, a while back, you visited and you gave me this gift. And I remember when you gave it to me, for a second I thought it was a meteorite, but you know what it is? It's the oldest object that I own. It is a piece of slag from iron smithing. What were they doing? Forging.
Smithing and iron and forging. So, I mean, one thing, and there's a very common myth that about, especially when we look in contrast, when we talk about things like Isandlwana and stuff, is very oftentimes from a Western perspective, we're painted this picture of these very civilized and very advanced Europeans, right? And these uncivilized and underdeveloped, technologically, like native people. And that is... Well, it's a narrative, but there's no truth to it at all, I mean, societies in Southern Africa have been smithing for an extremely long time.
Yeah.
They've been at ironworking and all of that stuff for quite a long time. Among them was the Bokoni, and they're a very, very early smithing culture, and we have only a couple of places where slag is left over, and to sort of understand the importance of this is to take ore as it comes out of the ground, raw iron as you find it in the wild, so to speak, and convert that into iron you can use to fashion weapons with, is a complicated process from a chemistry perspective. Like, you can't do this without a functional understanding of chemistry, right? You need to know what is the chemistry that goes behind it. So, iron as we find it in the ground is littered with what we would call like pollutants, is a bunch of other chemicals that are, that would degrade the quality of the iron. And so you have to go through a complicated process that includes heating the metal at the ore at ridiculous high temperatures, and then introducing further chemicals to siphon out the waste product, the stuff you don't want in your metal, right? And the leftover of that is usually what we call slag, right? And as societies progressed, they had developed more advanced ideas of chemistry and more advanced ideas on how to make their metal more refined and more cleaner and more reliable. So, you find more dense, one could say, slag to be more modern, and more sort of loose slag with little bits of iron in it to be much older. This is an example of one where you can see that the slag is still got, quite a few bits of usable iron in it, which never made it into a final product. But yeah, so the Bokoni were fascinating society in that they developed smithing far beyond war as a concept, or as a global concept. Combat, sure, that existed, but from most of our archaeological understanding, we sort of have the understanding that they weren't that big on combat or warfare.
Interesting.
The oldest things we have that were smithed by the Bokoni were tools, mostly farming tools, axes, hoes, knives and things like that. Even a kind of a buckle is the one artifact that was found. So this was just like, they developed it not for combat reasons, but for like everyday life practicality. Very fascinating culture. Eventually, of course, society being society and the world being the world and humanity being humanity, all-out warfare and militant societies would introduce them very much to the concept of war as a whole. But in the earliest days, small raiding, minor raiding, and a little bit of pillaging would have been the main aspect of what they understood war to be. The concept of warfare as a big and expansive thing with large armies marching up and down and structured military, that did not come until much, much, much later for them, when they came across the Swazis for the first time. To be more accurate, when the Swazis came across them and found, well, here's a society that's doing very well for themselves and they have a lot of good resources, let's see what we can do with that regard. And,
So these people, where's the site located?
Right, so we have sites that are vaguely associated with the Bokoni people that scatter around everywhere from like Orakstad in Limpopo all the way down to Carolina in Mpumalanga.
Sure.
And that whole sliver, everything from there all the way into the Leidenburg Valley areas of like Mashishing and everything around there all the way to Orakstad.
I see.
And everything in between there seems to be where we find the majority of our sites.
Okay.
Prior to that, there's a good couple of archaeological papers that shows that some pre-Bokoni people were living in like the Komate River Valley and places like that. So, at some point they moved from there into that sort of sliver of mountains and valleys, which was probably a good move for them, because when war did find them, it serves to be a very good place to defend.
And this reaches back very far. The Bokoni people have been living in that area. So firstly, they're not a united kingdom. It is I'm just wondering, maybe like a confederacy, people who understand each other's languages. Did they make war against one another? Do we know?
So what we do know is that there was a very strong commonality of like language, some religious ideas. So even though this village and that village have got like some slightly different ideas. They're both Bokoni in that they both share the same architecture, the same cultural practices, terrace, specifically very unique terrace farming practices, similar language ideas, and then religion, obviously. And these things unite, would very easily unite two villages. Now, would there be squabbles between two neighboring villages? Very likely, obviously. But for the most part, there was something of a unified front amongst Bokoni people in that there was no central primary government. There were chiefs. There was no kings that we know of, like one king over everybody. Everybody seemed to sort of like do their own thing a little bit, you know. Different chiefs had regional authority over their own villages to work with. But there was a strong attitude of trade, and this is one of the biggest things about the Bokoni people is their trade empire was how they became so, I could say, so healthy as a society. Is not only were they producing goods for themselves, but they were producing in surplus to trade. And so, you know, if you're in a society that by culture treasures trade and industry over warfare, and you come across somebody who you might disagree with, right? You're in a bit of a better footing to negotiate, you know. You've got, you know, items I could need, I've got items you need. Let's trade. Let's strike a bargain here, you know. And so at the height of the Bokoni, you know, their society, we know that they were roughly estimates will say that they produced roughly about 8 to 9 tons of food produce per year, right? And if you look at their population, that was way more than what they needed. So what were they doing with it all, right? Well, the logic thing is we already know through cultural history that they were trading it, that they were selling food to everybody else around them because they had it. They were producing enough of it. So starvation wasn't a very big thing in the early days. Their very first capital was an enormous settlement called Moshamatsi. Very huge. Today, it is just south of Ntokozweni, and it has, it's a wonderful site to visit. Now, because of the stone walls and stuff that are left there, there are a couple of people with less than stellar sanity that immediately point to you know, aliens and everything that built it and all, but no, the archaeological evidence is quite solid and sufficient about, you know, who built it and why they built them and whatever. And so we're left with a very large capital. We know that when warfare did find them, this was about the early 1500s, right? The very, very early 1500s, late 1400s. Some of their first people that were raiding and beginning to attack them on a large-scale military standpoint would have been people that they referred to as Mopono, which I believe, I'm not 100% sure, I'm not that familiar with the Bokoni language, but I believe that the understanding is that was the Swazis, right?
Okay.
And
so what date are we looking at now? Where are we at now historically?
Right now we're looking at anywhere between the, let's say, 1490s until, you know, like 1520s. We're at a point where raiding is happening, combat is getting a little bit intense here, and a society that was not traditionally, that did not have a standing military, that did not build its capital of Moshamatsi as a defensive structure. You know, this whole, it was built on a big flat plateau, right? With roads and streets and buildings and stuff, but no dividing walls between sections of the city. So, you know, it was not a very easily defendable place. We have the history of a single chief who made the decision and managed to convince the collective amount of the society to move closer up into the mountains, near to where the Leidenberg River Valley begins, and to basically found a new capital there, but purposefully to build it to be defensible. And that was when Wahlopela was built, and Wahlopela was their subsequent capital that was distinctly designed to be defendable. It was up in the mountain. It had like a panoramic view on either side of what's happening where, and the walls were built much higher. There were choke points in the little settlement, and it was built on the one side of a valley, where there's a little stream, and on the other side, right? So the mountains up at the top, it's much harder to come over a mountain. If you come around and come in through the valley, you have a natural choke point for your enemy. And so this is some smart tactics for a society that had no prior history with, like...
First of all, I'm very glad that we have our own alien theory.
Yes.
I'm very glad to hear that.
Go talk to Michael Kellinger. He'll tell you all about it.
The second one is, I have a question, is where did they get I keep getting confused. Are you saying Bokoni or Bokoni? Bokoni, okay.
Yes.
Why do we refer to them as the Bokoni people or Bokoni people if they didn't have one royal head, and you said they had different chiefdoms and
right.
stuff? Yeah.
So there's a variety of things that make up an identity, you know, and among them listed is things like common cultural practice, common language spoken, and common religion. So we have a variety of villages that speak the same language, that have the same cultural practices, that have the same religious ideology and things like that. So to them, they identified themselves as like, well, I'm the same as you, you're the same as me, this is where we work at.
Okay.
The word Bokone in their own language, and again, I'm not an expert on their language regrettably is extinct and is not very well studied. But I believe the etymology means like people, the people from the north.
Okay.
And there is vague theories that the Legoya were like, that they may have been in some way related to the Legoya. The Legoya were the southern branch that just died off, you know, or integrated with other tribes. So I'm not 100% sure about the factual elements of that. You know what they say is, if you want two people, you know, to get along, just find a third person they both hate, and suddenly you'll find them on the same side. And that's basically among the many different factors that lead to a unified identity for the Bokoni.
I remember me and you were in a museum somewhere, I can't remember which one, and it was a little artifact, and the plaque said it's a spear. I think it's a Sutu spear. And what I was looking at was a short sword. It was anybody would look at it and be like, no, it has a handle, it has a guard for the hand, and then the blade goes up into a straight blade, but it's been sharpened, you know, on the sides. This is a stabbing but slashing short sword. And I remember at Isandlawana there's some weapons out there that you can come and look at. And I remember looking at one of the Iklas there. It's a short sword, and it's not that short either. You know, like the iron smithing was good enough to really get a proper blade out of that thing. And the one I saw wasn't as thick as you always see in the pictures. The one I saw was narrow. I mean, that just slips between the ribs like nothing else, like this. So, what kind of weapons did people use, and specifically these people? And was there a culture of having certain regiments being armed with certain things, or was it your preference? What kind of spears? Throwing spears, stabbing spears, throwing iwisa, fighting iwisa, you know, all these things that we don't know about.
Right. So with regards to the Zulu, as you mentioned over there, there were multiple kinds of spears. You know, like we're so familiar with the Ikra, we don't actually know that that's just one kind of weapon. It was a very popular weapon. It was popular for close quarters combat, you know. But you had javelins, shorter spears with, you know, fine little tiny points that were used for throwing, you know, and the larger, like lance, the nkonto, that's not like a spear, right? So we have a variety of different weapons, of different kinds of spears that are used for different scenarios, you know. Are you trying to throw a spear at an enemy over there, or is this enemy right in front of you right now, and you gotta, like, that very large nkonto is fantastic at keeping your enemy away from you. But if he's here, what are you going to do? In a scenario like that, you're going to be grabbing an ikra because you're right here. You can stab, you know.
One strategy that I see with stick fighters, stick fighting cultures with shields, because not all stick fighting cultures uses shields. The ones that does, sometimes they would clash. Their shields would clash, and it becomes a wrestle with the shields. And I think in that case, that's where, I mean, that's why They knew that you needed something to get underneath the shields in, you know.
Right.
And again, Roman gladiators vibes.
Yes, yes. Well, Shaka Zulu understood there was warfare prior to Shaka Zulu was littered with these extremely strict rules. And among them included which side you have your shield on and which side you fight your spear with, you know, which hand is holding which. And Shaka Zulu got this novel idea of like, let's swap it around, right? Imagine that, you're fighting somebody and they've got the weapon on the other side. Yeah. Now what do? When all you've done is trained for opposite combat and you're not training for open combat.
Yeah.
So one of the drills that Shaka Zulu pioneered was the drill of use your spear, make contact, use your spear to open a gap, and then stab, right? And that, shield, you use your shield to make that opening and then stab, and that worked 90% of the time because people were just unprepared for it. They were unprepared for a different way of fighting, you know, for fighting left way around versus right way around or whatever. And that makes a very big difference.
I often think that the story of Shaka Zulu suddenly coming to this realization that you can surround your enemy for the first time in history, and suddenly, you know, short stabbing spears just work. When with the frontier wars down in the Cape with the Amakhosa, there it's very clear that they knew all these things already. It's just common knowledge. I think those memories of Shaka Zulu doing it is a man who changed warfare in a very much more deep. I mean, how do you explain to a non-martial artist open stances versus closed stances?
Right.
You know, you have to do a bit of. You do need to do a few classes to understand how significant it is when you're fighting a left-handy.
You need to get hit in the face a couple of times on the wrong side to realize, hang on, I got to protect that side.
Yeah, this guy fights with his feet the other way around. It just changes everything. I'm not used to this. I think that is just a memory of him changing things. There's this term that's being thrown around, and I don't know if it's correct, the infumkani, or the defumkani, I heard it as well. The scattering, or the crashing. I heard an Afrikaans term from Morselen.
Well, what a term. Is
that just a massive change that took place in Southern Africa?
Well, yes. We're also looking at... this is also in the backdrop of a significant famine, you know, many years of very hot weather and extremely little rain, where crops are getting less and less and less. So militant societies become more incentivized to be more militant because a simple day's labor is not producing enough anymore, you know. And what do you do in that scenario? What is left, you know? In a scenario like that, raiding your neighbor's goods becomes a very appealing object when you guys are hungry, you know. I'm not gonna lie, like it becomes an appealing perspective. This is one of the things that led to the conflict that eventually found the Bokoni people and how they ended up getting into warfare, because they had to completely change their society to become comfortable with warfare. We look at Mohlopela, their new capital. And suddenly we begin to see that axes that were made for chopping things are now being reforged to chopping people. The design is changed. Previously we had what they like just a stunted like sea axe, right? The blade is just a round little bundle, and that's very clearly designed. It's short, it's stunted, it's designed to you chopping wood with that, right? You're making hard impact on things consistently. It's wearing down, so you got to build something that wears down. And then suddenly we see the design of their axes drastically change. Now they're adopting a design that we've modern day called like the swallowtail design, where we have a tang, right? And then sort of a V shape, where you have, you know, a blade running this way and a blade running this way. And this becomes fantastic at hacking at people, you know? Not to be too gruesome here, but suddenly you see tactics have to change, right? And with that, your weapons, your equipment must change too. The question you asked about, you know, what do we know about the combat strategies there, and we don't know that much about what the Bokoni were doing from a military standpoint. We knew that they preferred ambush tactics that let the enemy come where we can control the fight, you know. Don't go out to look for them, you know. So just north of Mohlopela, before we get to one of their other capitals, their later capitals, Kutwaneng, there was 2 forts that were built on either side of the valley, right? And I don't remember the names, but I know the translation was the left claw of the eagle and the right claw of the eagle, you know. And while the claws are both there, you know, the eagle's watching everything in the valley. And the Swazis, as far as we know, were not very familiar with the fact that those forts were there. But eventually, even Metropela was attacked, and it was also sacked at some point, eventually. But one of the more interesting things is we see a very small example of what some historians and archaeologists believe, that they may have tried to use a formation where instead of marching forward to surround an enemy, right, have the enemy advance and you collapse your ranks until they fall into being surrounded themselves.
Sure.
Which is a very clever tactic, you know. You have the center line retreat back just a little bit, and just a little bit, and just a little bit, until suddenly you have a V shape where you have men running along this side and men running along this side, and the enemy is coming further and further, bottlenecking themselves, right? Very stupid decision, but it happens progressively over the span of the battle, you know.
Yes.
So it's hard for the enemy to immediately realize that they're doing this to themselves. We know that there was a good combination of close quarters axe combat, and then of course traditional spear combat. And it seems that, at least in the scenarios of later on, when the Marota, the Bapedi, sacked their capital of Cotonou, the capital was sacked and the army had retreated back to a fort, right? One of the forts, not one of the Eagle's Claws, but one of the another fort that they had in the mountains. And they were doing a fantastic job at holding off the siege. And they built the fort on that part of the city with such keen understanding as to create natural choke points in the flow of it, that your enemy was never going to be able to march at like full-on force one go.
Yeah.
And effectively what they would have is they would have two bands, a band of men wielding spears, and they're at the front, they're keeping distance, right? They're making sure that the enemy stays away. It's very easy. You keep your enemy far away from you if he's at the end of your spear, and that's fantastic. But as they collapse closer and they retreat into that, you have, regiments of close quarter combat axe wielders that phase through. So by the time the spears get closer and the enemy is now on your doorstep, they don't even realize that they are now within melee combat range. And then, for lack of a better word, they're screwed from there on, because they're surrounded and they're in melee combat, unprepared. So this worked fantastically, but in the end it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. But there's an awful lot of these weapons that are used.
No, it's fascinating. There's a lot of the weaponry, the fighting styles that we don't. Not everybody knows about it, but it's still there. It's still there. So the people that you were talking about, that city finally did fall. It got sacked. What happened to the people? Who are they today? Is that a fair question to ask?
I'm not the same, actually.
Yeah. This is a very complicated question because. Once Moshopela was sacked, they moved further deeper into the mountains between the two, near where modern day Mashishing area around there, the place of the tall grass was the translation there. The implication is a good place to hide, So you also have now a society that is more on the back foot than it was before. Eventually they founded a newer capital, Cotonou, and over time, more raids, this time by a new enemy, the rise of the Bapedi Empire, the Marota Empire, as it's more correctly known. They thought this is a fantastic area to be pillaging and making good, to turn into a vassal state. So the siege that led to the final collapse of their final capital was a very complicated one, and ultimately it was a traitor who revealed to the enemy, to the Bapedi, that, by the way, there is a hole in the wall that you can get your soldiers through and you can break the siege from the inside. And the Bapedi king at the time, he had two sons, and he ordered the one, he said, you take you and your men and you guys go, right? You go around, you find that hole, whatever, if it's an ambush, it's an ambush, good luck. but make sure you break the thing from the inside. And he was a coward. He didn't want to. He refused. He said, I refuse to do this. But his brother was like, I'm going to do this. And which he did. He went all the way around, took his men, and they eventually broke the siege. So since then, this was 1766, around there, give or take, plus minus, 1766. By that time, the Bokoni had now become vassals of the Maratha Empire, just were the Bapedi were the ruling class there of the Maratha Empire. Over time, they sort of became more and more integrated into the general society around, and less of their identity and more of the identity of what we can term was their sort of colonial overlords. The Maratha sort of began to slowly replace that. And so by the 1830s, nobody whose ancestors were Bokoni would identify as Bokoni anymore. They would say, well, we don't speak, the language. We don't believe in the same religion as the Bokoni people did anymore. We don't use the same farming practices. We don't have the same social ideologies anymore. And all of these things now line up with the identity of like the northern Sudra tribes. So that's the suck. We're just one of the many other northern Sudra tribes. And
interesting. I have a question, because it felt like you were foreshadowing this earlier on, and I just want to see if I got the events right, because at some point you mentioned that, what did you say the place was called? Gutwanong. Gutwaneng, okay.
Yeah.
That was
Gutwaneng.
So what was that?
Gutwaneng. Yes.
Am I saying it right?
Yeah, it is a little bit odd because it's coming from a language that
that doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't exist anymore. But we know that it was a Sotho-Tswana language. We know that it was vaguely related to things like Sepedi and Setswana and stuff. Like it would have been a sister language at least. But yeah.
Okay. In Tswana today, that would mean something with the roots, I guess. I don't know. You said the Bapedi people, at some point you were telling a story, and you said the Bapedi people came from, that was their capital, Kutwane.
The Bokoni's capital was Bokoni, right?
Okay, I just thought earlier on you had mentioned that the Bapedi people also came from this. I wanted to ask, is it after they took over the area, they occupied that area as well?
Eventually, when the Bapedi did take over, then they did occupy the area.
They did occupy. Okay.
And we have various stories of, there was a Bapedi man of no nobility whatsoever. He was a commoner. Who decided to effectively rally a bunch of rebels together, and he tried to re-establish some kind of a breakaway identity, which he then named after the Bokoni. He was like, well, I'm going to refound the Bokoni people and their culture and everything like that. It was not successful. But
you said this was a man of no nobility. Would this, I don't know
this
too much about history, but would this be a person who, not a product, his ancestors may have been the Bokoni people? And
it seems like unlikely, given his family name, where his history came from and stuff. But it's likely that he was from like a Mopedi side, and then became perhaps more enamored with a fanciful idea of let's create our own kingdom now based on the history and the story
of
the prior kingdom.
Okay, I understand.
No, and he got quite. He was mostly quite successful in reinvigorating interest in the history and the culture of it amongst the people there. But ultimately, his lack of success of actually getting to that point meant that he ended up refounding Kotoneng and built a new capital over it, right? Now, what's interesting is that that new capital had, the walls were built with gun holes. Because this was now an age where firearms were a thing, where the Bapedi were trading firearms from the Portuguese and stuff. So you now have a thing with the newest weapon, the newest form of martial combat here is we're shooting. We're making like gun holes in our walls so that people can put their rifle through and shoot properly. Sure. The quality of the guns, unfortunately, were not very good quality guns, but it tells you like the span of the time period that we had a society that had no formal idea of weapons. And as the time progressed, because of what enemy they're encountering, they're having to adapt to the enemy. Now they've got like spears as weapons for other people and a more military, like rows of spears now, right? And then we have swallowtail design axe for combat, and ultimately all of that builds up to firearms. Now we're shooting each other and everything like that. And it's quite exciting to see like those little tiny steps in history as we slowly move towards the modern age, each time adapting.
No, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
to sort of end off that question there, ultimately I would say nobody today strongly identifies with the identity of the Bokoni. I don't think I've met or even heard of many people who would identify themselves in that way. It's an extinct society whose language and history, is left in history. There's not really much of it around today in terms of identity and things. Who is it today? You could guess and presume that a good chunk of the people who have been living in and around like Mashishing around there would be like some of their ancestors probably, would have been identified as Bokoni. But if you ask them today, they probably will not give you that answer.
Yeah, it's more complicated.
It is more complicated. Identities is a very complicated subject. It's not as easy.
You said earlier off camera.
I was just a quote from a friend of mine. I asked him what, looking at a economical chart of Italy, and I asked this friend of mine, what happened to the Romans, man? Aren't the Italians Romans? And it's like, is anybody who they used to be anymore? And I'm like, that's actually very true, because these things are very fluid. Things that I'm finding very interesting is the amount of siege warfare you just spoke about.
An awful lot.
Not something that I expected. I knew that there was, but I didn't know it was a thing. And then also, I mean, the story of this guy who has this tale that most probably grew up with this people. Let's refine the old empire. Let's refine. How many times in history does that happen? Often where historically there's this memory of a thing, and you're like, it shows you that it is human nature is incredibly similar everywhere.
It's funny, when he's saying that, immediately I'm thinking, like, this guy sounded like he was about to start a cult back then.
Isn't that the function of all leadership? Is that there is a cult element to leadership in to governance in general? I mean, we look at how very different is today's modern day election campaigning and stuff like, and the propaganda that has to go into that, and trying to convince your voters to vote for you. Like, how very different is that to some cult-like behavior? Like, we're all a little bit culty in our own ways.
I think if you're gonna rule, you need a story.
That is true.
Yeah.
This is true. You need a story.
Our government right now has a tale, and there's a story that they share. And every party in a way has their own little story. This historical character, as you said, had no noble birth, nothing. He had to now create something. And how often do you see that happen? No, we're calling back to the glory days of this empire. We're going to rebuild this empire on this base. I think it's incredibly fascinating. I think it's super important to understand South African history, the stuff that hasn't been written down, the stuff that you don't learn in school, because it gives you such a full picture. It just makes the present make so much sense. Because South Africa is a very confusing place. My wife is from the States, and I'll take full responsibility. I didn't completely prepare her for South Africa. I didn't think it was important. There's nothing to talk about. Turns out it is a deeply complicated society, and to understand why things are the way they are. This one moment, and I think in a way maybe I could say this is where I started really looking at military culture in South Africa. I was watching an old film that was filmed here. I don't even know what it was called, but the scene of Blood River is in the film, right? It's a black and white, and you see the lager, and you see the Zulu army showing up, and then they suddenly charge together, and they all throw their spears, and now they're going to charge this. And I remember the battle cry goes out as they charge, the Usutu, and then everybody starts doing a battle cry, and 90% of the people are actually whistling as they. And Nicole's reaction was like, "Is that what they sound like when they attack?" I'm like, "Yes." And it's like, but I never thought about this. I'm like, yes, no, 100%. This is what a Zulu battle cry sounds like. You hear the Induna call out the attack, and people scream, Usutu, and then people start. The way it's even difficult to say what it sounds like, but when you hear it, you know it. It's a charging force in South Africa. There's people whistling and certain things are being said. And I said, but look at the Native Americans. Like, I don't know what they sounded like or what it seems like, is that they had a battle cry. And Nicole said it is called a war whoop. That's what she grew up calling it. It's an Indian war whoop, a Native American war whoop. And that just made me realize, like, oh, there's a lot to this. How do you even to start understanding? And this is just something as simple as a battle cry. There's a lot. There's a lot. I mean, siege warfare and all these things are just fascinating.
It is.
Yeah.
So much to cover.
A lot to cover, and we will have our follow-ups. I think we'll definitely, if it's okay with you, we'd love to get
For sure. I'd love to be here.
Yeah,
I said you had one more question for us.
Yes, my big question, the last big question. In our society today, in South Africa, as South Africans, and also all three of us here are martial artists, and we put a lot of time, for an adult, we put in a lot of time in cultivating a skill, ultimately, that to hurt people. That's what it comes down to. From the outside, it looks like we're training every day to hurt people. What is the role of the martial artist? And ultimately, a martial artist, I believe, falls into that warrior culture thing that we spoke about. It's martial as in warrior, not martial as in military, because our allegiances is not to a military. Our allegiances, in my mind, and this is something that I want to cultivate in our school, it's the community. Our allegiance is there. So where do you find yourself as a South African martial artist?
Well, precisely there. I think if I could use, in keeping with the theme, to use a historical example over here, in Zulu culture, for the military, for the army, you reared into a regiment, an Ibuto, and the men in those regiments are your community, even whether they're blood related or not. Those are your brothers now, right? You go to the work with them, you find work with them, you collaborate with resources with them. On the battlefield, that's who you've got your back, right? Is that sense of community. And so I feel, personally, what attracts me to the martial art culture, particularly in our school specifically, is the sense of community. It's the idea of yes, there's an element of fitness, which is great, but I mean, I can go to the gym, I can do Pilates, whatever. There's a variety of ways that one can get fitness. There's a variety of ways that one can get discipline. Granted, martial art discipline is a very specific kind of discipline, and it's really great, but there's multiple ways that one can obtain a lot of these things. But the fraternity, the community that comes with the martial arts as a principle, you're training together, you're doing blood, sweat, and tears, and you're exchanging ideas around the concepts of, yes, we are training for these hypothetical scenarios of combat that we hope and pray never happen, and so there's also an element of vulnerability. You share your fears and your anxieties with that community. And so from my connection point, I find the community that comes with the martial art culture, that should, in my opinion, come with the martial art culture, is really an underrated aspect to it. It is something that is, it's a big deal. It's a big deal to have that community of people who we kind of going through the same blood, sweat, and tears things. We have the same anxieties as well, the same fears, and I think that's having the same goals is maybe not always as important as having the same, the same positives is not always having this as good as having the same flaws. If that makes sense, So to share in a little bit of that, I think makes us all just a little bit more human and a little bit more connected to each other, And adding on to that, martial arts as a hobby, right, is predominantly devoid of a lot of the principles and ideas that we tend to latch onto to want to separate us as people, and age no longer becomes a very important factor when you're in martial arts and you have someone who's slightly younger than you but who is several belts above you, that are more experienced, and yes, they're younger than you, but they can kick your ass. Can I say? Can I kick
Sure.
your ass? I'm not sure what the policy is on
No, it's all right.
on cursing on your podcast here, but that earns them a little bit of additional respect despite their age. Things like gender identity no longer becomes a factor. Your cultural upbringing and all of these things are a secondary aspect to the fact that you are now in a fraternity with somebody who is training with you in the martial arts setting.
Yeah.
That becomes the primary focus, And I think that's an underrated aspect to the experience, at least in my perspective.
Kim, thank you very much. Before you say
Yes.
goodbye to Kenny, I just want, because Kenny said some stuff that I didn't even know that you could study about. I thought was
Go through them.
gone and forgotten. I just want to say, if you don't mind, just say where someone who's interested in these things that you spoke about today, like myself, where can we find this information? Where can we read about it? Where can we learn more about it?
Right. So one of the most important resources I think you can look at is South African History Online. They tend to compile a little bit of academic resources of the academic papers and stuff that's discussing these things. A lot of history papers and archaeology papers are available and publicly available online. You can read them. These are very essential things for people to read about. But I mean, it's a bit of an academic legwork to go and pile through academic papers on archaeology and academic papers on history. But the information is available. So sahistory.org.za I find is a good starting point. They summarize some information. And that usually stands as a good jumping point to get into where to find some more deeper papers. Papers published on academia.com as well. It's not a bad idea. Go have a look there. But if you look up the academic papers that are available, right, and study the scholarly consensus on those, you'll get a good understanding of what's going on in terms of the historical picture that is South Africa, what we know, what we don't know, and all the little murky things in between.
And where do people find you if they want to tour?
People find me if they want to tour. Kungwini tours. We do everything that you can imagine, everything from cultural tours, which we've discussed today, but we also do nature tours, adventure tours, everywhere in Southern Africa. So if there's an exciting place that you want to see, an exciting activity that you want to do, then we can make it happen. Including, I can take you guys to places like Moshomatse and the ruins of Watrapela, and you can walk around and physically see what's left of the walls and all of that stuff. There's exciting places and stuff to see that you would drive past and you would never know it's there. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, we'll pack a camera, we're going.
We'll shoot some stuff there.
Thank you for your time. I really
Absolute
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, guys.